high priority areas for migratory birds in East Asia is this part of China. I'm not sure when many of us are familiar with the geography of China. There's a part of China that's south of Beijing and all the way along the coast running down to Shanghai. There's this very extensive area of coastal wetlands. We refer to it as the Yellow Sea. The Yellow Sea is just one of the most amazing areas in this region for migratory birds. If you ever had the chance to go there to one of these wetlands, you can see literally 100 times more birds than you will see in any average wetland in Singapore. So I just want to make some references to the map. This part of the East Asian-Australasian Flyway, we call it the Yellow Sea region. It is often considered to be the bottleneck of all migratory waterbirds in this flyway. So nearly every single windrow, every single plover, every single curlew sandpiper that you see showing up anywhere from Penang to Singapore would have to go through this point. And so this area we now know to be extremely important. For a lot of conservationists out there, we are fighting with developers and working very closely with government agencies to ensure that these wetlands, which are so important to migratory birds, are preserved for as long as we can keep them as nature reserves. So this is the general area of the Yellow Sea. Many of the familiar shorebirds that you see in Singapore would have passed through the Yellow Sea on their journeys here, including some of the commonest shorebirds. At the same time, many of the rarest shorebirds that we have in this part of the world also use this region of wetlands. The best known for many of you would be this very, very fluffy, very cute little shorebird, maybe no bigger than my fist. That bird is called the spoon-billed sandpiper. There are not many of them left in the world. The last time we tried to count them across the world, the numbers that people thought was pretty confident were somewhere between 200 individuals to 500 individuals. So the spoon-billed sandpiper, obviously, as the number shows, is one of the rarest shorebirds in the world. But of course, there are other very, very highly threatened shorebirds that utilize the Yellow Sea. Some of you may have seen the bird in the middle. The bird in the middle, I think some of us may have seen a small group of them at the Sungai Buloh Wetlands Reserve not many years ago. The bird at the top, that bird is a bird that moves from the lakes of Mongolia to the Yellow Sea region. You will never ever see it in Singapore, but if you live, say, in Shanghai or in the coastal areas of Beijing, you will see this very, very spectacular looking gull called the relic gull. There are less than 100,000 of them left in the wild, and they mostly spend their winter on the coastal areas of the Yellow Sea. So here's a nicer picture of the spoon-billed sandpiper. The picture, as you can see, is 25 times larger than its real size. It's a really tiny, very petite looking bird with a very peculiar feeding style. Now, still on the spoon-billed sandpiper, we know it's very rare. We know that there are less than 1,000 of them left in the world, and we know that it's gone through such a massive decline. Scientists have tried to calculate how many of them were around, say, 20 years ago, and they have tried to measure how many were around in the last couple of months, and they see that back in, say, the late 1990s, there were more than 50,000 of these birds around. Now today we have about somewhere between 200 to 500 birds. So doing a little bit of mathematical modeling, scientists know that this bird has gone through a spectacular decline of more than 90%. So the spoon-billed sandpiper has shown the greatest decline of any shorebird we know in this part of the world. And now we are trying our best to conserve the bird in BirdLife, which is one of the leading NGOs working on the conservation of waterbirds in Asia. We have lots of colleagues, very passionate individuals working on the mud flats, trying to count how many sandpipers are there, trying to get people not to hunt them for food and all that kind of thing. So the spoon-billed sandpiper is one of these birds that are the focus of very, very intensive conservation efforts in the East Asian Australasian Flyway. Sadly, these birds, they don't ever migrate to Singapore. In fact, in the history of Singapore, there's been less than 3 records, one which was more than 15 years ago. So, coming back to the conservation aspect of things, like I mentioned earlier, the East Asian-Australasian Flyway is a very, very, very large region, very important to migratory birds. More kinds of migratory birds move along this region than anywhere else on Earth. We counted more than 600 different species of migratory birds moving along the flyway. And as I pointed out earlier, there are some areas that are really, really important to them. We are trying to make sure that these very, very important sites are preserved through a combination of science and advocacy and engaging with the local people, trying to get people not to hunt birds and giving them alternative ways of living. Now that you have got a really, or should I say a fairly good understanding of migratory birds, now let me go on into the books that we've been talking about today. So the book that we will launch today, that many of you will hopefully get a copy at the end of the day, is this very humble little field guide called the Field Guide to the Waterbirds of ASEAN. I want to give you a little bit of background because this book is not a new book actually. It's a book that has got a bit of history. Many years ago, in fact before some of you were born, there was its predecessor that's been going around, and I think we have in fact got a copy circulating here in the crowd, maybe going up in the back. There's this very lovely looking field guide that I saw when I was in primary school, but I couldn't afford it because it cost a bomb. Those days is this lovely book called The Field Guide to the Waterbirds of ASEAN. This book is a very important book, a pioneering piece of work in the conservation of migratory birds in our part of the world. It's a very, very nicely produced book by many of the key bird specialists who were around in the 1990s, some of which are still very active in our field today. This book was produced to help people go out, count migratory waterbirds, identify them, and then with those information they've collected, send it back to those researchers who will then use those numbers to identify where are the key areas for migratory birds. Are these birds declining? Are these birds increasing? This book was a very, very powerful, very influential tool in helping us understand migratory birds in East Asia. Of course, the sad thing was that not many copies of it was published. In fact, I think there was only 10,000 copies, and they were not very easy to get. I think by the time I was in secondary school, when I had more money, there were no books left. So for a long time, there was no such tool for many of us out there who are counting birds, especially those of you who are involved in this activity that happens every year in the month of January, the Asian Waterbird Census. How many of you here are involved in the Asian Waterbird Census? Show of hands. Okay, that's very encouraging. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, so take note that at the end of this talk, all of you will now be volunteers for the Asian Waterbird Census. All right, you have committed yourself to be part of this endeavor. So anyway, this book was very hard to get. It has some of the best artwork. I think a lot of you who are out there who have field guides, collect bird books, you would enjoy books that were painted and books that had very nice illustrations. So these were one of those very rare books available in the 90s. So it was out of print, and a few of us got together 2 years ago to try to rectify this problem. We were thinking there are such great issues in conserving waterbirds in Asia. There were so many people out there in Asia, especially in Southeast Asia, who had no access to material like this that could assist them to go and survey birds. What can we do next? So some of our colleagues from Korea had this great, bright idea that we could resurrect that old book. And so there were lots of meetings that came around, and we had so many interested people who were keen to contribute. But then the next big question for a lot of us was that, okay, we want to make a new bird book. We want to help conservation in Asia. We want to get people going out there to the wetlands to count birds. How can we create a tool to help them do all these things? We can make a field guide. We could resurrect the waterbird guide that I showed you in the earlier slide. So all these ideas were drafted out, and then we were faced with one problem: no money. So lots of discussion, of course, had to follow, and then it occurred that there's this wonderful organization that we all know very well in our lives called ASEAN. ASEAN, a lot of you would have seen in the Channel News Asia and all those various forums. It's of course a very well-known politically supported grouping of people. A lot of our politicians are involved in ASEAN, but not a lot of us know that ASEAN actually has lots of tools and resources to support conservation. And so our colleague in Seoul decided to reach out to ASEAN through a very generous mechanism called the ASEAN-Korea Cooperation Fund. The ASEAN-Korea Cooperation Fund is basically a very large pot of money that the Korean government gives to poor ASEAN people like us to do environmental projects. And so a proposal was submitted 2 years ago. And of course, those officials sitting in the hallowed halls of Jakarta and Los Baños decided that, all right, you've got this bunch of very enthusiastic people from ASEAN countries and from Korea who were very keen to do this. They looked at the proposal, and after lots of deliberation, they decided that, okay, we'll give this guy a few $100,000 to make a bird book. So after all the signatures were achieved, we had the resources, and then the next challenge was to bring together people to contribute to the book. We wanted this project to be an inclusive project that involved people from all countries of ASEAN. So our colleagues in BirdLife, our colleagues in Korea at the university, at the Seoul National University, they managed to band together about 10 different bird lovers from different ASEAN countries out there. And then we were asked to do various things. We sat together for a number of meetings, discussed what needs to be done. We managed to get the artists. The good thing was that the artist who illustrated the original book was still alive. So even though it was 20 years ago, he was still out there, very active, and we got him back to this project. He was very supportive, very keen to work on this book, and after about 6 months of lots of discussion and late nights writing text for this book, we were able to finally get this book out. So once again, this book wouldn't have been possible without the generosity of two very important institutions, the ASEAN and the Korean government, which provided the funding to ASEAN. So I know they have no representatives here, but I think we should all be very grateful to them for having the vision to produce this tool to help us do waterbird surveys. So that was how the book was born. We hope that for all of you who eventually get a copy of the book, would be able to not just support the Nature Society in our work out there to get people interested in nature, to get people out there counting birds and providing data to guide our conservation. We also hope that you would use the book to inspire your friends to become nature lovers. So with that, I think I end my very short talk. How much time did I take up? All right. Okay. So
More than what you said.
more than what I said. Okay. So I think we'll stop here because people are getting edgy. Maybe we can have a very short question and answer session.